India was a largely agricultural society more than 4,000 years ago, just before the Aryans arrived from Central Asia. In fact, they were really in decline. The mighty Indus River, which supported a very complex society, had been less predictable, causing people to leave places like Harappa to go back to smaller villages. Great minds that could have continued the innovations of that society were pulled by their families in different directions, with some going east to the Ganges River and others heading further south onto the Deccan Plateau. In short, it was not a good time to be an Indian. Things were about to get worse. From the northwest, a new wave of intruders approached. Unlike the Indians, this society was obsessed with war, glorifying battle and destruction in their art, but especially in their poetry and literature. Known as the Aryans, this group of invaders would leave a mark on India that no culture since has matched. But who were the Aryans? The writings from India that survive, which were in fact no small part written by the Aryans themselves, describe them as mighty warlike invaders from across the Hindu Kush mountains, well into Central Asia. In fact, historians have found significant evidence for a society that was very similar to the Aryans of Indian lore in Uzbekistan, complete with many of the same artifacts that the Aryans brought to India. Yet the best link for the Aryans back to Central Asia was nothing they carried, but instead how they talked. These new invaders brought a new language, Sanskrit, which actually had more in common with Greek or even modern English than any of the languages spoken in India at the time. This is because Sanskrit, like almost every language in Europe, is an Indo-European language. This means that the first speakers of Sanskrit came from a place not too far away from the first speakers of the languages that eventually evolved into European languages like English, Greek, or Spanish. While the Aryans brought new weapons such as iron-tipped spears and war chariots to India, neither was really what conquered the subcontinent. Oddly enough, it was also the language of the Aryans that proved to be one of the most enduring aspects of life after the invasion. Soon, more and more people in India were speaking languages that were related to Sanskrit. This is pretty easy to understand. It is helpful to speak the language that the powerful people speak. That way you can talk to them and get better treatment, if not a completely better life. However, it wasn't just a better life that these new speakers of Sanskrit, or the languages that would descend from it, had an interest in. Instead, it was a better next life, or life after that, or the one after that even. That's because Sanskrit brought a whole new body of religious literature, known as the Vedas, that would eventually become the core of Hinduism. These provided the basic tenets of Hindu belief, especially the idea of being reborn based on the merits of one's accumulated good deeds or karma. Such beliefs fit in well with the already existing Indian practices, and its emphasis on the individual's journey rather than an emphasis on a community of believers meant that Hinduism found little opposition in India. It is in language and religion that the Aryans left their biggest marks on India. No society or invader since has completely mesmerized the people of India with such a new culture, nor has one fit so neatly into existing norms of cultural behavior. With Sanskrit, India received a religion that was custom-made to express the intricate nature of its new and expanding set of religious beliefs. Likewise with Hinduism, millions of Indians found a new belief system that did not care where one's existing social status was, because frankly, if you lived a good life, it was going to get better. Also, given the warlike nature of the new invaders and their relative power in India for the following centuries, India soon became fragmented into different states, often at war with each other, but rarely for religious reasons. In this lesson, we discuss the impact of the Aryan invasion of the Indian subcontinent, both as a military conquest and as a cultural achievement. The role of Sanskrit, both as a spoken language and as a religious language, received a great deal of attention, as did the ability of Hinduism to fit in with existing Indian beliefs. Finally, we discussed how Sanskrit was an Indo-European language, and how that helped to confirm legends about the origins of the Aryans in Central Asia.
Meet Alexander the Wee. His father, Philip II of Macedon, was king of Macedonia. Macedonia was a large, relatively empty kingdom to the north of Greece. For decades, Macedonia had been in decline, yet Philip was about to change all that. Macedonia had long been under the thumb of the Greeks. During his youth, Philip himself was kept as a hostage by the Greek city of Thebes. After the Peloponnesian War, Greece's main power players, Athens and Sparta, were weakened and exhausted. The time was ripe for Philip to thrust his backwater kingdom into the civilized world. Philip began by conquering his neighbors. First Thessaly, then Thrace, then Molossia were added to the Macedonian Empire. Yet things did not go so well in Greece proper. The Athenians and Thebans both still held sway over large territories. As Philip slowly dismantled their empires, they fought back fiercely. The Greeks might be all too willing to kill one another, but when a foreign enemy appeared, they generally united to protect themselves from invaders. Yet Philip was more than just a conqueror. Rather than attempting to invade wholesale, Philip used the wealth of his new empire to begin establishing his own league of allies, forming a Macedonian party. As more and more key city-states joined his cause, Philip was able to pressure the remaining Greek city-states into submission. The end result was the League of Corinth, an alliance that included most of Greece, with Philip of Macedon at their head. The lone holdouts were the warlike Spartans. Philip sent the Spartans an emissary, saying, "You are advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your city." The Spartans replied with just one word, "if." So, Philip decided to leave the Spartans alone. Nevertheless, rather than having to conquer the Greeks, Philip sought to lead them, and, after a brief period of resistance, they fell into line. The Greeks respected Macedon's martial prowess, and the Macedonians respected the cultural and intellectual achievements of the Greeks. With the Macedonians leading the charge, Greek culture was poised to conquer the world. Yet, just as everything was looking so grand, Philip was assassinated in a lover's quarrel with his ex-boyfriend, Pausanias. The rule of the empire fell to Philip's son, Alexander. So much has been made of Alexander's greatness that we often forget that Alexander inherited much from his father. Philip left Alexander a wealthy empire around the Aegean Sea. Alexander received the combined power of the Macedonian army and its many allied Greek states. Alexander also received a top-notch education from the greatest mind of his time, Aristotle, who returned to the Macedonian court after years spent studying and teaching in Athens. Finally, Alexander had watched his father turn a cultural backwater of a kingdom into the most powerful empire in Europe. With these advantages, Alexander began a lightning campaign of conquest. Alexander's campaign is noteworthy for its speed, its breadth, its tactics, and its strategy. The same phalanx formation which had so frustrated the Persians as they invaded Greece was now mobilized and brought to the enemy with devastating effectiveness. First, Asia Minor was ripped from Persian control. Next, the Levant and Syria fell to the Macedonians. Alexander pressed south into Egypt, which welcomed him as a liberator and showered him with gifts. Doubling back, Alexander drove his army to the old kingdoms of the Fertile Crescent. Alexander then pressed on to the heart of the Persian Empire and smashed it to bits, dissolving an empire which had once been the largest in the world and adding it to his own. Yet Alexander was not finished. He pressed further east than even the Persians had dared to tread. He invaded modern-day Pakistan and subjugated its peoples, and even pressed across the Indus into the Indian subcontinent. Up until this point, Alexander was undefeated. It was in India, on the banks of the Hyphasis River, that Alexander first tasted defeat. Not at the hands of enemies, but from his own soldiers. Thousands of miles from home, exhausted and war-weary, and absolutely terrified of India's war elephants, Alexander's soldiers mutinied, and the progress of the Macedonian war juggernaut ground to a halt. Alexander was forced to turn back and lead his army on the long and dangerous journey home. Yet no one could say that the campaign had failed. In just over a decade, Alexander had conquered an empire stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Himalayas. This was, in essence, the entire known world of classical times. Throughout his conquest, Alexander showed that, like his father, he was a keen politician as well as a powerful warrior. He burned the cities that resisted him, killing their men and selling their women into slavery. Yet he showed remarkable leniency toward those who opened their gates to him. Moreover, he made allies of his fiercest opponents, expanding their kingdoms and making them his vassals. Along the way, Alexander wove himself into the mythologies and religions of the peoples he conquered. At Troy, he visited the tomb of Achilles, endearing himself to the Greeks. In Jerusalem, he respected their strange god and accepted a place in their prophecies. In Egypt, he took on the role of liberator, expanded the freedom of the Egyptian people, named himself the son of the Egyptian god Amun, and took up the title King of the Universe. Alexander continued this process throughout his conquests, pardoning the weak, forming alliances with the strong, and donning the regalia and trappings of authority from every culture he visited. Yet Alexander did more than just conquer and destroy. He also built. Alexander's empire spanned more barriers than just mountains and rivers. Cultural divisions, linguistic distinctions, religious differences, all these threatened to tear his empire apart. To unify these disparate cultures into a single civilization, Alexander established Greek-style cities across his empire and installed clever Greeks to run his empire for him. These cities became administrative centers, run by imported Greeks. To make the new Greek administrators feel at home, each city strove to be more Greek than Greece. In a relatively short time, Greek went from an obscure language spoken in a tiny corner of the world into the official language of an empire spanning some 2 million square miles. This process of spreading Greek culture and language is known as Hellenization and marks the beginning of the Hellenistic period. In the end, Alexander did not get to enjoy the fruits of his empire for long. He never even made it home. Alexander died in Babylon, though our sources are not clear whether it was from poison, sickness, or pure exhaustion. With no clear heir, Alexander's empire was in danger of collapsing as soon as it was formed. Alexander himself was of no help. On his deathbed, he bequeathed his empire to the strongest. As no one was sure who this meant, Alexander's generals and kin fell to fighting among each other. In the end, Alexander's empire was divided into 4 smaller kingdoms: the kingdom of Macedon, the kingdom of Pergamon in Asia Minor, the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, and far to the east, the Seleucid Empire. To summarize, Alexander the Great's success was built upon the successes of his father, Philip II of Macedon. Alexander inherited an already rich empire with powerful vassals and allies. With this head start, Alexander conquered the known world. He was undefeated on the battlefield, yet also politically cunning. In 10 years, he had conquered the known world. In his wake, he established Greek cities with Greek administrators, and thus began the process of Hellenizing, or Greekifying, the ancient world. Alexander did not get to enjoy his empire, though. He died on his way home, and his generals and family split his empire into 4 kingdoms: the kingdom of Macedon, the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, the kingdom of Pergamon, and the Seleucid Empire of the East.
Although short-lived, the massive empire that Alexander the Great created had lasting effects throughout much of the known world. One of the places it had the greatest effect was actually in India, thousands of miles away from Macedon. In fact, before he finally gave in to the desires of his army to head back to Greece, or at least Babylon, Alexander met with a number of Indian princes, both to see who he could trust, as well as to remind the Indians who was in charge. One of the men Alexander met with was someone he felt some level of trust for, but would soon build an empire to match Alexander's own. His name was Chandragupta Maurya. Of course, building an empire from a small realm was difficult for even the most gifted of leaders. However, Chandragupta had a superb guide in Alexander. After the Macedonians' death, Chandragupta began attacking to the east and south. He recognized that Alexander was unable to effectively rule too far of a distance on either side of the Hindu Kush, and he knew that with strong Greek powers to the west, his best chance for success was to attack the rest of India. Luckily for Chandragupta, India was in a state of disarray. even more so than the Persian Empire that Alexander had conquered. For starters, at least Persia had a relatively strong central government, at least in theory. India was still split into several different smaller states. Chandragupta used existing rivalries between these states to control them all. Soon, the resulting Mauryan Empire stretched from Afghanistan throughout India, with only the southernmost tip of the subcontinent escaping Chandragupta's control. Despite such achievements, we still rely on the writings of a Greek ambassador to the Mauryan court for much of our information about how Chandragupta ruled. While not all the book exists, the parts that do survive tell the story of someone who was obsessed with being the most efficient leader possible. Chandragupta knew that with such a diverse empire that he would have to be viewed as fair, and therefore the idea of justice became an obsession of his. Luckily for Chandragupta, his empire was wealthy enough to maintain justice for many different groups of people, or at least the ability to pay off those who felt wronged. The Mauryan capital, Pataliputra, dwarfed any city in the ancient world, with a perimeter of almost 90 miles around. Only Rome itself, which had a population of over 1 million at its height, could be compared to Pataliputra, and that was 400 years later. Efficiency was central to running both Pataliputra and the Mauryan Empire, as everything was controlled by the state, which in turn switched out officials often to limit the opportunity for corruption. The Mauryan Empire would reach its greatest power under the grandson of Chandragupta, Ashoka. Ashoka would continue to expand the empire's borders, much like his grandfather had done before him, and had a great deal of success in pressing new territories home for the Mauryan Empire. However, after a battle in which an incredibly large number of soldiers from both sides were killed, Ashoka was upset by the huge amount of loss that had been demanded for a few extra miles of territory. Deciding then and there that the true path to greatness was by finding truth rather than by finding new lands, Ashoka converted to Buddhism. He built massive stupas, or buildings to house relics of the Buddha, in order to demonstrate his piety, as well as provide a reminder as to the fact that Buddhism was now officially encouraged. Of course, Buddhism never quite caught on enough to displace Hinduism, as India had always embraced a multitude of religions. But the physical reminders of his rule, namely the stupas, that hold relics of the Buddha, remain to this day. After Ashoka, the regional governors of the Mauryan Empire became increasingly powerful, with the emperor having power largely in name only. External powers took advantage of the situation and soon were carving out chunks of the empire for their own. Within 200 years, the Mauryans were a memory. In this lesson, we learned about the Mauryan Empire, from the days of Alexander the Great inspiring Chandragupta Maurya to establish the empire on the Indian subcontinent, to the masterful administrative job performed by Chandragupta in keeping the empire together. We also discussed the role of Ashoka, and how ultimately the empire fell apart after his reign. Darkness, chaos, division, collapsed empires, war. This was the condition of India for nearly 500 years. Then, in the early 300s CE, change appeared on the horizon in the form of a Raja from the Magadha region in the northeast. This Raja's name was Chandragupta, and he was about to inaugurate a whole new era in India. Chandragupta was actually the third ruler in a new royal family, and he was determined to expand his kingdom. His quest began in earnest around 308 CE when he married a princess of another powerful family, gaining the territory, wealth, power, and prestige that came with such an alliance. As the years passed, Chandragupta grew more and more powerful, and about 320 CE he crowned himself Maharaja Dhiraj, which means Emperor or King of Kings. The Gupta dynasty was well on its way to controlling India. Chandragupta didn't live to see his dynasty turn into an empire. The Maharaja Dhiraj told his son Samudragupta to rule the world. Samudragupta tried his hardest to fulfill his father's last wish, which suited him just fine, and actually succeeded in conquering vast areas of India after coming to power about 335 CE. Over the 45 years of his reign, Samudragupta created an empire that extended all across northern India and into modern Nepal and Myanmar. Through military conquest, he subdued king after king. Those he didn't conquer directly, he forced to pay tribute, making himself their sovereign for all practical purposes. His power extended even into central and southern India, where he made alliances with kings who were all too anxious to keep their powerful northern neighbor happy. By Samudragupta's death in 380 CE, the Gupta Empire was strong and flourishing. Samudragupta's son, Chandragupta II, assumed the throne in 380 CE and ushered in a golden age of prosperity in the Gupta Empire. In daily living, India's upper classes enjoyed the lap of luxury in their extravagant houses and gardens, with plenty of food and drink, entertainment, educational opportunities, and social activities. The middle class also thrived, accumulating wealth and moving up the social scale. Even the poor classes were better off than before, as charities abounded and hospitals provided free medical care to everyone. In fact, during the Gupta reign, Indian doctors made some significant advances in medicine, including a smallpox vaccine, herbal remedies for all kinds of illnesses, and even a type of reconstructive plastic surgery. They also wrote elaborate medical treatises. Other branches of science flourished as well. The astronomer Aryabhata, for instance, figured out that the Earth was round and even calculated the solar year as having 365 days. He also determined the cause and timing of solar and lunar eclipses. Scholars were busy in the field of mathematics, too, inventing the decimal system, using 0 as a placeholder, and developing the system of Arabic numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., that we still use today. In the arts, writers produced great literature in the Sanskrit language, especially folktales and fables that would become the basis for such later classics as Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and Aladdin and his magic lamp. Artists, too, created great paintings, like those of Buddha in the Ajunta caves, and magnificent sculptures, like that of the Hindu deity Shiva, in a temple close to Bombay. An old proverb says that all good things must come to an end. The same is true of the Gupta dynasty. Chandragupta II's successors were not nearly as powerful as their three famous ancestors. By 480 CE, invaders from the north called Hephthalites, or White Huns, were poised to invade the empire, and soon they came crashing down into India, leaving a path of destruction in their wake. At first, Skandragupta, the grandson of Chandragupta II, drove them off, but they soon returned, and the emperor's efforts to resist them weakened the empire and diminished the treasury. People accustomed to luxury and ease were forced to tighten their belts, and they didn't like it. Conflict arose in the ruling family, and lesser rulers like governors and chieftains took advantage of the discord and rebelled, creating even more chaos in the empire. The invaders, in turn, took advantage of the empire's internal turmoil and redoubled their efforts, finally overrunning the empire, massacring inhabitants, and burning cities. In the midst of the destruction, portions of the empire declared independence and broke away from Gupta rule. By 520 CE, the Gupta Empire was no more than a little kingdom that had to pay tribute to another ruler. 100 years later, it had completely disappeared. An era of darkness, chaos, division, and war had returned to India in the wake of another collapsed empire. In the early 300s CE, Chandragupta, a Raja from the Magadha region in northeast India, rose to power. He increased his power, territory, wealth, and prestige through a marriage alliance, and about 320 CE he crowned himself Maharaja Dhiraj, which means emperor or king of kings. The Gupta dynasty had begun. Chandragupta's son Samudragupta, who assumed the throne in 335 CE, created the Gupta Empire, which extended all across northern India and into modern Nepal and Myanmar. Samudragupta's son and successor, Chandragupta II, ushered in a golden age in India when he became emperor in 380 CE. Daily life improved for all classes of the population. Doctors made advances in medicine. Scientists, like the astronomer Aryabhata, discovered important truths about the universe. Mathematicians developed the decimal system, The zero placeholder and Arabic numerals. Writers and artists created great Sanskrit literature, paintings, and sculptures. In 480 CE, invaders from the north, called the Hephthalites, or White Huns, invaded the empire and left a path of destruction. Skandagupta drove them off for a while, but taking advantage of internal chaos, they soon returned. By 520 CE, the Gupta Empire was no more than a little kingdom that had to pay tribute to another ruler. 100 years later, it had completely disappeared, and India descended into darkness.
Most modern cultures have had their own golden age, a term we use to refer to a time of great accomplishments that allowed the culture to prosper. The country of India had several of these golden ages, but the most popular golden age of India took place during the Gupta Empire. The ancient Indian Empire lasting from around 320 to 550 CE. It's particularly popular, in part, because it was the longest of such eras of accomplishment, lasting more than 2 centuries. It also comprises some of the most substantial accomplishments in Indian history. Let's explore the Gupta Empire in more detail, the accomplishments of the empire, and its downfall. The Gupta Empire was ruled by the Gupta dynasty, which controlled northern and central India, as well as stretches of southern India. Much as they are now, these regions were heavily populated. The first ruler of this empire was Chandragupta I, who came to power by conquering much of the Ganges River Valley. The Ganges River Valley was of great importance because it contained abundant resources and was located near the capital city of Pataliputra, which remained the capital of the Gupta Empire. Before Chandragupta I, the territories of India were heavily divided and constantly at war, but Chandragupta I reintroduced the politics and principles of the Maurya Empire, which ruled a relatively peaceful empire more than 500 years prior. So, Chandragupta I was largely welcomed by the people. He, as well as several other predecessors in the 200 years prior, led a successful empire focused on social and economic stability. The Gupta Empire saw a vast range of scientific and cultural achievements. To the chagrin of many high school math students, trigonometry and geometry got their start during this golden age, and Gupta mathematicians developed the concept of zero and the number system. Other major contributions from this era helped improve human health. Not only did scientists and doctors expand the alternative system of medicine called Ayurveda, but they also improved surgical practices and helped popularize vaccinations. But the Gupta Empire didn't focus solely on science and math. Art and architecture were abundant during this time. In fact, the son of Chandragupta I, Samudragupta, was an avid art lover and commissioned works that can be found in museums to this day. The Gupta Empire is also responsible for a game still popular around the globe today, chess. Perhaps the most remarkable facet of the Gupta Empire was its approach to religion. The empire helped to spread Hinduism to other nations, particularly throughout Southeast Asia, in areas that traded heavily with the Gupta Empire, and the rulers of the empire were Hindu, but they did not force religion on the Gupta people, as so many rulers have done in other cultures. Rather, it was largely an era of religious freedom in India. So, Buddhism also flourished during this time. A Buddhist university was erected, and the people of both Hindu and Buddhist religions lived together peacefully and helped to inform each other of their beliefs. Sadly, this religious freedom ended with the fall of the Gupta Empire in 550 CE. Out of the north came several waves of barbarians, including the Huns, that helped to weaken the Roman Empire. All right, let's take a moment or two to review. The Golden Age of India was a time period of great scientific discovery. It took place during the Gupta Empire, the empire that lasted from 320 to 550 CE. This empire helped introduce the world to the concept of zero, the number system, new surgical practices, vaccinations, and even the game chess. The Gupta Empire is also famous for its religious freedom. Buddhists and Hindus lived together peacefully until the fall of the empire in 550 CE.
The first Muslims to invade the Indian subcontinent came from Afghanistan, led by Mahmud of Ghazni. Finding a way through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, such as the infamous Khyber Pass, Mahmud was able to repeatedly raid a region that was largely unaccustomed to being attacked from across the mountains, aside from the occasional minor Central Asian incursion. Ironically enough, many of the soldiers in Mahmud's army were actually Central Asian in origin, due to the institution of the Mamluks. Mamluks were slaves who were converted to Islam at birth and then raised as an elite corps of soldiers who were absolutely loyal to their leader. These Mamluks served alongside the rulers of the new states, who were heavily influenced by the Persian culture of their home in Afghanistan. In reaching the Hindu populations of northern India, Islam faced a problem that it had never seen before, an obviously civilized society with seemingly pagan beliefs. The Quran made its stance on the pagan idolaters of pre-Islamic Arabia very clear. These people should be converted or killed, as opposed to Jews and Christians who were to be taxed but otherwise left alone. However, Indians did not have the same monotheistic ideas about religion as the Muslim invaders did, so the earliest attempts were focused on conversion or extermination. That said, these first invaders soon realized the impracticality of killing or converting so many people. So instead, Mahmud of Ghazni had created a substantial Islamic culture built on Indian gold and Hindu sweat. Out of these conquests into northern India, all heavily militarized due to their Mamluk contingents, grew a government known to history as the Delhi Sultanate. Not surprisingly, it was centered on the city of Delhi, and while it remained heavily reliant on the influences of Islam and Persia, a considerable Hindu influence continued to creep in with respect to art and culture. However, that newfound respect for native Indian culture did not translate to greater successes in actually conquering any more of India. Like earlier empires in India dating all the way back to Alexander the Great, the northern river valleys were relatively easy to conquer, while the mountainous terrain of the Deccan Plateau proved to give the tactical advantage to the defending South Indians. The Delhi Sultanate had much more success in two other facets, notably in defending India from the Mongols. However, the more enduring of the Delhi Sultanate's achievements on the lives of many in the subcontinent was nothing political. Instead, it was the role played by Sufis, or Islamic mystics. Traditional Islam presented a completely foreign idea of the nature of religion to Indians. In both Buddhism and Hinduism, the central idea was communing with the greater power, even to the point of becoming one with it. However, traditional Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, focused on worship, not necessarily becoming one with God. Sufism presented a way to be Muslim and, through mysticism, to still become one with God. As a result, while Islam never became a majority religion in much of India, it was able to gain many sincere believers through Sufism. Ironically, the end of the Delhi Sultanate, which had itself originated from raiders from Central Asia, was to come from the steppe. While the Sultanate had been strong enough to oppose attempts by the Mongols to conquer its lands, it was unprepared for the incursions of another invader from the north. The government in Delhi was weakened after years of excessive taxation, with regional rulers less likely to offer their support to any initiative from the Sultan. Tamerlane, also called Timur Lenk, was a Turkic invader who sought to recreate much of the old Mongol realm. That said, much of his work actually destabilized the lands he entered rather than providing the stability of the Mongols. Nowhere was a better example of this than Muslim India, where the political power of Islam was greatly weakened following his attacks. Coupled with his incursions into northern India was a renaissance of Hindu beliefs. This ensuing Neo-Hinduism placed a greater emphasis on communing with a greater power, as well as having inherent appeal to the cultural roots of many Indians. Suddenly, many of the religious gains from Sufis mystics were taken back by Hindus, who could find similar experiences through the faith of their native land. This lesson detailed the first years of Islamic rule in India, starting with the incursions of Mahmud of Ghazni into northern India. Mahmud faced cultural frictions with the Hindu majority population, but soon Islam in India evolved to be relatively open-minded, as was evidenced by the Delhi Sultanate. While the Delhi Sultanate may have been weakened by excessive taxation and ultimately the attacks of Tamur Lane, Islam suffered its greatest setbacks with the loss of gains by Sufi mystics to neo-Hindu beliefs.
Throughout history, the lands of India and Pakistan have been ruled by many differing empires and forces. Today we'll travel back to the past, discovering one of these ruling entities as we explore the Mughal Empire. To begin, the Mughal Empire ruled over India and Pakistan in the 16th and 17th centuries. This empire gets special kudos from history in that the Mughal rulers were Muslim, yet for most of their reign they peacefully ruled over a predominantly Hindu population. In other words, the rulers were Muslim, while most of the commoners were Hindu. However, and very unlike many other empires, the Muslim Mughals were surprisingly tolerant of other religions. In fact, it's recorded that they even allowed Hindus to hold senior positions within the civil government and the military. As an empire, the Mughals were able to consolidate the smaller kingdoms of South Asia, specifically within India and Pakistan, into one centralized government. They also succeeded in bringing Persian and Muslim culture into Hindu life. However, it must be mentioned that Hindu culture was not lost. In fact, under Mughal rule, the Persian language combined with Arabic and Hindi to form the language of Urdu. When taking into account their propensity toward religious tolerance and the way they were able to combine both Muslim and Hindu culture, I like to use some alliteration and think of them as the Great Mixing Mughals, or to borrow an American term, the Melting Pot Mughals. Whichever you choose, history usually gives them a nod for their respect for the rights and cultures of those within their borders. Keeping this key point in mind, let's fill in some history for this empire. The Mughals were descendants of the Mongol Empire. Like the Mongols, the Mughals were a military force to be reckoned with. In fact, it's asserted that they were some of the first in the region to use guns in warfare. Babur is often considered the first Mughal emperor. Interestingly, he was believed to be a descendant of the great Genghis Khan. Coming to power in Delhi sometime around the year 1526, Babur was a religiously tolerant leader who mixed the cultures of the Mongols, Persians, and Hindus into one. It's even reported that he respected the Hindu practice of not butchering cows. Remembering that he was tolerant to other religions and that he was the first emperor, I think we'll be safe remembering him as Babur the Benevolent at the base of the empire. Unfortunately for the people of the empire, Babur's son, Humayun, was a catastrophic ruler. He lost much of the lands established by Babur and was more interested in a life of frivolity and drug use than ruling. Although he did at one point try to regain some of the empire, we can remember him as Humayun the Horrible. The last emperor we'll discuss is Abu Akbar. He is considered by most to be one of the greatest rulers in Asian history. Fortunately for the Mughals, he regained much of the land lost by previous emperors. Keeping the tradition of religious tolerance, Akbar married a Hindu princess and even adopted some Hindu principles as his own. Adding to this, he put an end to a tax that had previously been levied on all non-Muslims. In short, his reign saw previously unequaled religious tolerance for all belief systems. Taking this even a step further, history tells us that Akbar's reign saw the birth of a new state religion known under the rather broad term of Godism. Stated rather simply, the Mughal Godism was a mixture of Hindu, Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. On an interesting side note, within this system of Godism, Akbar took the liberty of declaring himself a deity. Overlooking this little sojourn into self-aggrandizement, we can remember this guy as Akbar the Absolutely Admirable. With religious toleration, the Mughal Empire ruled over India and Pakistan in the 16th and 17th centuries. Descending from the Mongols of the Far East, they were Muslim rulers who, for the most part, peacefully ruled over a predominantly Hindu population. Not only were they religiously tolerant, they also combined the cultures of the people within their lands. For instance, their reign saw the use of Urdu, the Persian language combined with Arabic and Hindi. Babur is considered the first Mughal emperor. He was a religiously tolerant ruler who took power in Delhi around the year 1526. For this reason, we can remember him as Babur the Benevolent at the base of the empire. Babur's son, Humayun, was a disastrous ruler. Losing much of the empire's lands, we can remember him as Humayun the Horrible. Abu Akbar is given the title of one of the greatest rulers in Asian history. He regained much of the land lost by previous emperors. He married a Hindu princess and removed a prejudiced tax against non-Muslims. Going even a step further, he mixed the religions of his lands into a belief system known as Godism, a mixture of Hindu, Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. In this religion, he was considered a god. With this, we'll remember him as Akbar the Absolutely Admirable.